visual thinking. Why is this a skill at all?
It kind of reminds me of something my mum used to say about common sense, in that common sense isn't that common. It's surprising how many people don't apply common sense, things that they seem obvious. And so I'd argue that whilst we all can and do think visually, or most of us do, um, we don't all know how to apply it to get results. And I think part of the confusion when we talk about visual thinking is it's kind of like business analysis in a way. It's a broad term that can mean different things to different people. So when I speak about visual thinking, I think of it as using visuals to help us think more clearly. And whether that's trying to frame a problem so we understand it better, whether it's to help us work with others to generate ideas, or whether it's helping us communicate complex information, visuals is using visuals to help us literally see what we're saying and get people on the same page is what I'm talking about. And I think specifically when Paddy and I practice visual thinking, we tend to focus on how do you use doodling and hand-drawn sketches to improve the way we work. So that's kind of how I think of it.
How many people, to your evaluation, really think about visual thinking as a skill and apply it, concisely? Well, maybe from those people you met before.
I think it's surprisingly low. I've always gravitated towards a whiteboard, grabbed a pen, and used it to communicate. And yet, I see in the BA profession in particular, a lot of people just have that fear when somebody hands them a whiteboard pen, right? And they've got to try and express their ideas. So I think a lot of BAs are really comfortable writing a document or using a modeling tool, but just free format sketching their ideas, I think that's less common in my experience.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And so often we hear people brand around lots of different terminology like critical thinking, design thinking, visual thinking, but often it's difficult to know what we actually mean by these terms. And as Grant mentioned there, visual thinking is more than just talking about visuals. There are practical applications that we can use. And we often talk about the 5 different visual thinking types that our good friends at Bureau Brand, who are a leading visual thinking agency, have come up with. And I think it's really useful when we go through these 5 different types to really bring visual thinking to life. And we can really understand how BAs can be using this approach for their day-to-day work. So the first one is visual co-creation. So if we imagine BAs are often asked to collaborate, facilitate meetings. So the visual co-creator is somebody that uses visuals to really accelerate that collaboration. It could be as simple as drawing a metaphor. So for example, if we're running a retrospective, for example, we might draw the famous sailboat metaphor. And by having a visual as a metaphor, it often really encourages the team to get involved, collaborate, start to think a little bit more creatively as well. The other visual thinking type we often talk about is the visual reporter. Now, if you've ever been to a conference and you've seen that person at the front of the room who's drawing a visual and summarizing different talks just through hand-drawn visuals, is often a visual reporter. They're taking complex information and summarizing it in a visual format. So that's just another visual thinking type. One of my favorites is the visual storyteller. And this is somebody who, when they present, they'll be using visuals to help them tell a story and really help get their message across in a different way. And then we have the visual analyst. And I think a lot of BAs use this visual thinking type without really realizing it. So this could be us defining a process flow diagram or a data flow diagram. And what we're doing here is we're taking, again, complex information, but we're dissecting it using some visual template that we're either familiar with, or it could be a completely arbitrary approach to visualizing that particular set of information. A lot of us produce mind maps, for example. And then finally, the visual designer. And I think this is probably one of the types of visual thinking that we don't use as much as BAs, because this is almost like being a graphic designer. So when Grant and I do our presentations, we'll often digitize the visuals. So all of our slides are usually hand drawn, but they're very polished. Now, that requires a lot of practice and some special tooling. So it's a type of visual thinking that I don't think is, for everybody, but it's certainly super useful if you can master it. I sort of mentioned using the using a visual to facilitate a conversation. So a lot of agile practitioners will run retrospectives, and what we find is if we all just sat in a room and just verbally asked a bunch of questions, we're probably going to get less engagement than if we've got something to look at in terms of a flip chart or some kind of board. And so if you are running some kind of retrospective, there are tons and tons of different metaphors you could use. I mentioned the sailboat example. You can use the iceberg as a metaphor. So the iceberg is very much the top half of the iceberg are things we can see, and everything beneath the water are the hidden aspects. So again, it gets people to start thinking in a slightly different way. And then when we relate the conversation to that visual, we find that we unearth lots of golden nuggets. So I would say retrospectives are a great one for us to apply the visual co-creator stance.
So I think with visual storytelling, what we're really doing is using visuals to help reinforce a message, to communicate an understanding of something or to explain something. So in a lot of ways, a lot of the BA models that are out there are trying to communicate abstract ideas so that people understand them. But I'd argue that a lot of the BA models that we produce are a little bit dull and could do with um, jazzing up a little bit, and not to just prettify them, but to make people actually pay attention and take notice. So most of the BA models that we produce, they're pretty much boxes with text and arrows combining them. They're quite abstract and they're quite dull. Simply adding a few icons and visual representations that reinforce the meaning of your diagram. So even if you're producing just a simple process map, if you could have a little icon representing a part of the process that is an incoming message from a customer, some calculation happens, there's an output in the form of a report, somebody has to inspect the report, you can probably imagine little icons that could denote each of those steps on the way through. And I think if we do that, you can just glance at a diagram and you instantly get what's going on. You take away that mental friction of having to decode what's this set of boxes and arrows trying to tell me. So I think that's a really good way of using visuals to help you kind of communicate an understanding. But the storytelling part specifically, I think, is when you then need to try and inspire or change somebody's mind. So you go beyond just showing them a process. And if you want to tell a story of how things are going to improve, how do you really tap into people's emotions and get that across? So when I worked on a project a couple of years ago around simplifying a workflow solution for a client, I remember depicting a process where a robot was trying to interact with the the software. And I depicted it as being a painfully slow process where the customers of this robot are sat tapping their watches, waiting for information because of the technical limitations of that solution. And then I drew a visual that showed a robot plugging directly into an API that allowed them to move much more quickly. And they were on wheels and running really fast. And you could see from that metaphor and the visual representation how the benefit was going to land in the organization, and people just got it straight away. So that's probably more the storytelling angle, if that makes sense.
It looks for me like a visual reporter for some reason, because for example, when I, as a business analyst, I have this elicitation session with my client, and I get some information from them, and during the process I create the model, for example, use case diagram, right? And basically what I do, I summarize the discussion, maybe a 2 hour long discussion about the use cases and scenarios of what needs to be done. And this is a simple model that shows the gist of the conversation, the essence. Is it what the visual reporter is in business analysis?
So I would say that particular instance is more of the visual analyst stance, because what we're doing there is taking complexity and we're trying to simplify it in a visual to reinforce understanding and then start to get some feedback and refine that. So at the end of it, we come up with a visual that represents the world in its truest form. The visual reporter is whereby I'm trying to perhaps take knowledge and feed knowledge and make it memorable for myself. So I'll give you a quick example of that. My daughter at the moment, she's in her final year at school, which is a stressful year. Those of us that have got children or can remember that far back, and she's currently revising for some of her mock exams. And where every time I go into a room, she's drawing, and at first, I was thinking, well, is she just doodling for the sake of doodling? But then I saw what she had produced, and she's producing these sort of visual sketch notes that summarize the key topics that she needs to learn and revise. Now, that's really using that visual reporter stance by taking this information but making it more memorable. Again, we're still using things like metaphors because that helps reinforce some of the messages, but it's getting her to put down some information in a format that's going to be more memorable for her. And there's a great book called The Sketchnote Handbook, and I'm holding it up for those of us that can see this on video. It's by a guy called Mike Rohde, and he talks a lot about how we can use visuals to articulate information in a visual way and make it more memorable. I think Mike even uses the visual reporter stance to create recipes for his bread, because he makes bread. He's a big sort of cook, and there's some amazing visuals that he shares where he's just showing the process of him baking different types of bread, which is phenomenal, and it becomes really memorable.
I actually remember something from IRMK conferences, what Adrian Reed does. He basically uses mind maps to summarize the presentation and share key points. Is it the kind of visual reporting he's talking about?
Yeah, 100%. I think what Adrian does there is he distills, synthesizes information. He's predominantly doing it in words in a mind map, but he does put the odd image in there. So I think the visual reporter would probably lean towards more visual content to reinforce the words. But absolutely, the principle is the same. You're combining words and pictures to create a synthesized output that helps you remember the essence of something. Yeah, I've been to conferences over the years and taken my own visual notes, and it's amazing because what happens is I can look back at visual notes that I took years ago, and I remember what the talk was about. I genuinely can remember the topic. Whereas if I looked back at some handwritten notes from a conference I attended 3 or 4 years ago, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't remember it in the same way. There's something about the visual cues that act as anchors in our memory. They just create a connection to something that you understand. And I think that's where it can be really powerful in helping us to improve our ability to not only take in, but retain and recall information. So there's a real benefit in terms of learning new stuff. So if BAs are attending training courses or conferences or whatever, I'd highly recommend, even if it's just for your own benefit, doodling a few things in the margins of your notes to help just you remember the content a little bit better.
I feel like all those five kinds, they feel like evolution. So from visual co-creation to visual designer, is it like an evolution of the same skill or just different types?
The visual designer, as Paddy's already said, it's more leaning towards the graphic design end of the spectrum, using visuals typically in a standalone fashion to represent an understanding of something. So, a good way to think of that is think about an infographic that summarizes the 10 benefits of doing something. That kind of thing is where you would maybe use the visual designer kind of skill set. In a BA context, imagine that you've been working on a project for a long time. You and your development team have been working through a solution, and you now need to land it into maybe a part of the business who's actually got to use that. Now, hopefully, if you've been doing a good job of your business analysis, you've been engaging those people along the way. But with the best will in the world, if you're rolling out some software, for example, to thousands of users, you won't have engaged every one of them. But producing some visuals to help explain why do we do this, how is it going to help you, or how does this change your journey and how you would interact with the software, anything like that, you can use as and that's kind of tied in a little bit with the storytelling angle I mentioned, but the visual design aspect is about making those visuals coherent so they can stand on their own 2 feet. But I think, as you've already touched upon probably a couple of times, Yuri, and this isn't a one or other thing. At any point in time, I think they're just dials. Sometimes we're more in analyst mode, sometimes we're more in storyteller mode, and I think we can be in more than one mode at the same time. I could be acting as a visual analyst, trying to understand the complexity of something in a group where we're co-creating an understanding of the problem, so that they're not mutually exclusive. I don't know what that Venn diagram would look like if we drew it, but they would definitely overlap.
I see. So not evolution, but rather modes of the same skill. Gotcha, gotcha. And I thought that maybe the visual designer could be applied as a sketching or wireframing or mock-upping when business analysts create the UI of the software, like they do visual prototypes. Is that true?
Yeah, I'd say that's a perfect example. I mean, that's quite honed in and specific to visualizing what a screen or a part of a solution would look like. But absolutely, certainly, if you're trying to do that in a more polished way to show the final layout, maybe if you're doing a rough wireframe where you're just trying to tease out ideas and it's a bit more rough and ready, then maybe it's more in either the visual analyst or co-creation mode where you're
Mm.
just trying to throw some ideas and see what people think and get feedback. So
Mhm.
again, depending on whether you're doing a rough wireframe versus a more polished design, arguably that would fit.
Yeah, I think that that's a great thing that we show these big examples, because now every person who watches this, they would be able to, put themselves into the shoes of visual thinker and then say, okay, I'm doing wireframe, so I'm applying, visual design at this point. This is great thing to understand what exactly you do, and that's what we actually here for, right? To explain how this skill applies. And actually, I thought that you know, there are probably other applications of visual thinking. So we've established, I suppose, with what we discussed, that it's important and maybe critical skill, and the skill everyone relies on in different industries, not only professionally, but we actually rely as people on visual thinking. For example, you probably know that this phenomenon when the person sees something, like a part of something, and then the brain adds the rest. So you see the part of the car, you understand that this is the car, right? So this is one of the real life examples. But Patty, maybe you could go deeper into this topic and share about the essence of this skill, about its nature, maybe real life cases.
You're absolutely right. Our brains are really great at pattern matching. So Grant and I sometimes do this activity where we get the audience to draw some squiggles, just scribble on a page and sort of draw a few of those, and then we add some very simple sort of some very simple details to the squiggles, and we turn them into birds. So we put a little beak, we put some eyes, and the little feathers on the tail, and it's amazing just by adding those small details how you can turn this scribble into something that's recognizable. And 9 times out of 10, when someone looks at one of those scribbles, they will immediately say that's a bird. So we don't have to be artists. We don't have to be able to draw like Van Gogh or some of these other famous artists. It's often just about putting down enough on the page so that the human eye is able to recognize and pattern match and say, well, that is familiar. let me look in my database of visuals that I've collected over the years, and let me familiarize that and connect it to a visual that I've already got. It's kind of like how AI is programmed as well, right? So when we're programming these huge language models in AI, what we're doing is we're giving them lots of examples. And so as soon as we put forward a certain word or a sentence, the AI language model is able to match that with all these other patterns that it's received in the past. And that's exactly how the brain is working. And it's so effective because the brain processes images around 60,000 times faster than just words. So imagine if we have a slide and we have 5 or 6 bullet points on that slide. Well, if you visualize that, the human eye is able to sort of process that much, much faster in a visual format. So when we're trying to engage with our stakeholders, we're trying to engage with other team members, just by having a simple visual can actually fast track that understanding in a much quicker way.
It makes me feel like BAs are using outdated techniques to engage stakeholders when you say that. When I don't use visual, it feels me like, okay, I'm a dinosaur, I'm not doing something right.
I was going to say that exact point. I think BAs are absolutely using outdated stakeholder engagement techniques. We seem to assume having 1 hour meetings is okay. And we do that because Microsoft Outlook defaults every meeting to 1 hour. Yet when we look at the science behind that, the average person's attention span, it ranges. There's different studies out there. Some people claim it's only 7 seconds. I like to go with a slightly more conservative number, which comes from a lady called Gloria Mark. She's one of the leading researchers on attention span. And her studies have found it's around 47 seconds. So about the length of a TikTok video. And we see this everywhere. If we talk to young children, we talk to the sort of Gen Z generation, their attention spans are so short. And when we're engaging with stakeholders at work, I bet you they are having similar difficulties as well, which is to focus and hold their attention for long periods of time. So, really, we've got to look at ways in which we can engage better, use slightly more modern approaches, because otherwise we're in danger of people disengaging. And as BAs, that's a really bad place to be, especially when we need their inputs. We need stakeholders to be with us throughout that journey.
It's interesting that you mentioned this attention span and time you need to keep attention of the person. When I do any kind of presentation, I struggle every time to understand for myself, should I do animations or not? And if yes, how many of them? When I do a lot of animations and I use that understanding that everything needs to be changed on the screen like every 3 to 5 to 10 seconds max, but when I do so, people are annoyed by that. When I don't do that, they fall asleep. Is there a balance for that? Grant, maybe you could share on that.
Yeah, we struggle with the same balance whenever we're presenting. We try and make our presentations engaging and dynamic, but you don't want it to be to the point where it's off-putting, right? Where it's just things bouncing around the screen the whole time, and people are more distracted by the visuals than helped by them. So I think you've got to be mindful that whatever visuals you show on the screen, whether they're moving or not, they need to reinforce and not detract from what you're saying. Paddy talked about having a slide full of bullet points, and the reason that's really bad is typically people are trying to read those bullet points while you're trying to talk over the same thing. And so they're trying to decode 2 lots of verbal information at the same time. Or even worse, you're literally reading what's on those bullet points and they can do that themselves. And that just annoys people. So having content that complements what you're trying to say visually and reinforces it with the odd keyword that stands out, which emphasizes your key point, I think is key. And then in terms of anything to do with animations, movement, I think it's about using it sparingly. So Paddy and I do little tricks where we have video backgrounds playing behind something where there's a little bit of movement, or we switch a slide and we will play a short excerpt of music, for example, that just sparks people's interest and brings it kind of the focus of the audience back to you and what you're saying. We had a guest on the Visual Jam, the meetup group that Paddy and I run. There's a guy called Dan Rome, who's an author of lots of books, including The Back of the Napkin, I think is probably his most famous one. And Dan's a fantastic presenter, but what he does is he presents his slides and he just uses PowerPoint's annotation tool just to make a mark somewhere on the slide, just to underline a point he's making. And he says unapologetically, I'm doing this because human brains are wired for movement. So the second I make something move on that page, even if it's just underlining a word, your focus is right back on my slides and me. And so it's a really good way of kind of bringing the audience and their focus back to you. But I think if you just use one mode of movement on your slides again and again and again and again, that will annoy people, right? I think so. It's about having that variety. Maybe you annotate sometimes, maybe you use a bit of sound, maybe you use a bit of a video intro, some dynamic transitions, those kind of things. I think there's different ways that you can mix it up to keep it interesting whilst not being too much.
And just to add to that, those great points that Grant made, like we see this every day when we're watching TV or watching movies, right? The way that movie making is changing. I think it was the latest Fast and Furious film, Fast X, had the most amount of cutscenes that any movie's ever had. And what I mean by that is every few seconds they keep switching the camera angle because they're trying to keep the audience engaged. And I think there's a similar approach we can use with presentations. So as we're building up to the climax of the presentation, we could be starting off slow, getting people comfortable. And then as we're building up to that kind of climax, the key message, the thing that we really want people to take away, we can start to use these different methods to reinforce the message. So there's something called dual coding theory, which is about trying to embed visuals and text and words in two different channels of the brain, because when we're able to get both of those together, the brain is much more likely to remember things. Whereas if we just had a slide of pictures, then that's not going to be as effective as also using the words. So when we're building up to that climax, just as Grant said there, maybe switch over to doing a diagram, get people to understand the diagram that, hey, this is a solution that we really want to go with, and then reinforce it with some words. Then maybe switch back and start to go through some words that reinforce that same point. So we're really getting people to remember the message. And at the end of the day, we're not all visual. That's the other thing to note. We all have different preferences. It just so happens the majority of us are better at visual learning than just text based.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's common knowledge that most of people probably are visual learners, right? So without visuals, they hardly understand stuff and hardly learn stuff. So having pictures is not a privilege, is a must, right? And not only pictures but videos and animations, all sides of this. And I'm pretty sure there was some kind of research. What amount of information do we learn if it's in visual and in written form? Do you remember that?
Yeah, so I think sort of when we're given some information,
Hmm.
we're much more likely to retain it if it's visual. I think it's about 65% of
Ah,
the information is remembered if it's done through visuals versus kinesthetic, which is touching and feeling things, as well as auditory.
If you were to just share information in a text format, the study I'm thinking of, I'm sure it's something like 10% of information could be retained 3 days later when the learners had only looked at text. But when they combine text with visuals, that increased to 65%. So quite a difference when you combine visuals with words. And as Paddy already mentioned, that it's the combination that's actually the sweet spot. So just visuals on their own are better than just text in terms of triggering understanding and retention.
Mm.
But when you combine the two, that is the sweet spot. So let's be really clear. We're not saying words are bad, quite the opposite, but it's about using the right combination.
It's not possible to tell everything with just pictures, unless those pictures have text, right? Because some information is it's almost impossible to transfer to another person just by seeing the picture. We interpret information that we get, and sometimes we interpret it differently. So yeah, text is definitely a must in some critical points. What would be know that critical moments when you need to add text to picture?
I mean, I think you hit upon the point, Yuri, where it's when there's ambiguity in the picture on its own. So if you use just the pictures and the meaning's not clear, just adding a couple of key words can just take away that ambiguity and be really clear on what you mean. And I think the point you were making about numbers is interesting because you can just include numbers to make a point, statistics, for example, but actually, there's a way that you can represent numbers and data in a visual way that can help reinforce your message. So if you're trying to plot a graph and you've got 20 different categories of data points and you're trying to tell a story, you don't necessarily need to show all 20 data points, right, to make your point. So I saw a great graphic about obesity in like Japan versus other countries. And the original statistics was like 20 or 30 countries all in this big bar chart. But all you really need to do is show that here's Japan. It's got really low obesity compared to, I don't know, the USA, Canada, and France, or whatever. Just you need a comparison point to be able to make that point. And you can take away a lot of the noise. So even the way you visually represent statistics can have a meaning. And if you wanted to represent a key number, you can actually use visual storytelling to reinforce the number that you're trying to communicate. So I think a while ago, Paddy sent me a video, and it was a really good example of visual storytelling. I'll have to see if we can share it with you, Yuri. It was about single-use plastic waste, and there's this video where you press the button to the website and you start seeing plastic bottles falling from the sky that eventually stack up to the point where they cover a double decker London bus in no time at all. And it shows how that continues to scale to the point where in a year you've dwarfed the whole of Manhattan in plastic. And it uses relative scale and metaphors to kind of really hammer home the significance of the numbers. Sometimes you quote numbers and they don't mean anything without a comparison or an anchor point. And you can use visual imagery to kind of say, that's like the size of 3 football fields, that kind of thing. So using visuals to kind of reinforce key statistics is a really good thing to do as well.
That's, by the way, what a lot of documentaries, and I see this a lot of on BBC programs, for example, or some programs from USA, when they explain, for example, what's the height of Burj Khalifa. Right? They don't use the metric or imperial system to do that, but they explain, okay, it's like that amount of football fields because everybody's in a football field and they can stack those football fields. Now I understand why that happens. Now I think we could go deeper and apply it to business analysis even more by explaining how business analysts maybe upskill their visual thinking. Grant, maybe you could start on that.
Visual thinking, we use the analogy of a language because once you master visual thinking, it is like you've learned an extra language. And the great thing is, it's an extra language that everybody understands already. But once you learn how to use it, you tap into this extra way of communicating that can really change things. And I think for BAs to be able to do that, they just need to learn that language, right? So in visual thinking, in the book that Paddy just flashed up by Mike Rodey, he talks about the visual alphabet and how you can learn some basic shapes and then learn how to combine those basic shapes to create simple visuals. And then you learn how to combine those so you can articulate yourself visually, just like in language. So I could maybe show you, Yuri, if I switch my cameras, I could maybe show you what I'm talking about, and let's practice what we preach. So when we're talking about the visual alphabet, it's as simple as, can you see this okay? Sorry, let me just. Okay. So when we talk about the visual alphabet, it's as simple as having a dot, a line, a square, a triangle, and a circle. And at the simplest level, that's all you need to be able to draw pretty much anything. There are variations on the theme of these shapes. You could do an oval instead of a circle, but generally speaking, you can combine these elements to draw pretty much anything in a way that's good enough to communicate in a business context. So we're not talking about fine art here, we're talking about communicating ideas. And a really good exercise that Paddy and I like to do, a friend of ours, Martin Hausman, came up with this phrase that illustrates this perfectly. The word he uses is usmo. I think it's a completely made up word, but what it does is it allows us to say, if you can write these letters, then you can draw a light bulb. And then we demonstrate that. We draw an O, we draw a U, we do a Z, and we do an M. And just by doing that, we've created a simple light bulb icon. And you can take the same principle. If I can draw a rectangle, and I'm just going to draw a couple of rectangles, leave them open at the bottom for a second, I'm just going to add a few sort of uniform dashes like this, and then just add a more organic line underneath them. And that's a simple representation of an office block or a building. I've just drawn rectangles and done a couple of simple lines, nothing complicated. If I wanted to draw a laptop, again, I can just draw a rectangle. I can do a couple of slanted lines. So I'm looking now at the front of a laptop. I'm going to not get too complicated. I'm just going to suggest some keys on the screen. Maybe I've got a shine and some communication going on. So you can see how simple you can make it. If I want to draw people, we like to draw these U men. So we do an upside down U like this, and then we draw an O, and that's kind of like a pawn in a chess piece. Your people can be as simple as that. You can add a bit of character. So I've got a little smiley face there. Maybe this one is pointing off into the distance, and there's something that they've seen that's amazing them. You get the point. So just really simple visual shapes that you can combine them. And if you want to do maybe a group of people, I'm a little hungry, so I'm thinking about McDonald's at the moment. But if I carry that on, I can then draw a team of people. And again, if I want to, I can give them expressions. I can show that they're united. I can label who they are. So really simple ways of just representing objects, icons, people. And this basic combination of the visual alphabet to form these icons and create your own icon library, that's the foundation. Once you learn to articulate yourself visually and you know how to draw these things, it becomes muscle memory. And once you know how to do this, then you can actually start to have fun with it. You learn how to combine things, how to frame information, how to draw in real time when you're having a conversation. So we really encourage you to start from the basics. Think about what would useful icons be for you and your organization and your industry. Learn how to draw those, repeat them, and get them to become, like I said, muscle memory that you can then, when you're faced with the need to visualize something, you don't have to think about it anymore. You already know how to draw things. So that's just a really simple kind of little taster there. But does that make sense, Yuri, in terms of that idea of simplifying the the, the visuals to the point where they're just, squares, rectangles, triangles, and then combining them?
That's absolutely beautiful. Actually, I'm stunned how easy that is. But of course, you have years of experience, absolutely. But it still feels like it's very accessible to a lot of BAs. And I think there is a way to learn that visual alphabet somewhere, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've Paddy mentioned our friends at Bureau Brand. We offer training. We're kind of affiliate partners of Bureau Brand, and they've taught us their methods. So some of what you saw there was what Bureau Brand kind of taught us, but it's it's kind of, I guess it's quite simple, but it's simple when you know it. When somebody's shown you, you're like, all right, that it's amazing how obvious it is. So I think what we do is we demonstrate those building blocks in the training that we offer, and I think that, you know, more often than not, we get people coming in, and we always say at the start of a training course, how confident are you in expressing yourself visually in this way? And we ask them to hold up their hands, and like the number of fingers represents how confident they are. So are they super confident or not confident at all? And most people are kind of like, oh, I'm a one, maybe two if they're, but most people are like, oh, I can't really draw. ICD, we call it, don't we, Paddy? I can't draw syndrome. And yet we show them these techniques. And after a few hours of practicing and using them in different contexts, more often than not, we then say, how confident are you now? And people are like, oh, I'm at a three, maybe even a four now. So just in a short space of time, you can show people how, with a bit of practice and a bit of know-how, you can use visuals to articulate yourself.
That's really awesome. I should definitely be leaving a link for that in description because every business analyst should learn how to do that. It's great. Thank you for sharing that. I'm just enjoying it actually right now. Just
It's,
genuinely enjoying.
it's quite therapeutic, isn't it, as well, watching somebody
Yeah.
draw. So you
Oh
imagine
yes.
having a conversation, and as you're explaining something to me, I'm drawing what we're saying. We're having a conversation, and I'm representing the conversation in real time, like the proverbial back of a napkin. I'm sketching out, is this what you meant, Yuri? And you're like, yeah, apart from that arrow should go there because something else is going on. So
Hmm.
it becomes a great conversation tool as well. Make sure
One
you're on the
hundred
same
percent.
page, literally.
Yeah, yeah. I do support that. And I suppose this was beautiful, but I suppose there are more tips how business analysts can develop and improve in visual thinking. Patty, maybe you could share a couple of tricks.
Okay, I was going to talk a little bit about the science behind why people feel that they don't have the confidence. So it might be worth us exploring that kind of mindset that we talked about, the I can't draw syndrome. And we'll have a little bit of fun with this, Yuri. So you're going to be my audience, and I'm going to ask you some questions. So there was a creativity test done in sort of 1968 by a guy called George Land. And he was tasked by NASA to create this test to measure the level of creativity for future NASA engineers because they were looking for super creative people. And the test was so successful that he went on to try this test on the everyday person. And he started off with children. So, 5-year-old children. And he got them to do this creativity test. Now, this isn't about how clever they are. This was about how creative they are. So, how could they bring multiple ideas together and create new ideas? So, 5-year-old children were asked, or put through the test. So, out of 100% of those kids, Yuri, what percentage do you think scored genius level in this creativity test?
I think majority of them, because kids are not bound by anything like adults do, by responsibilities, burdens, and stuff. They are just free spirits. So I'd say if you allow me to give a range, I'd say from 80 to 100%.
Okay, great. I love that. give a range. You're definitely an agile practitioner because agile people always aim for ranges rather than a precise number. Absolutely. So around 98% of them scored genius level. And then he took those same children, and this was 1,600 kids. When they hit the age of 10, he put them through the test again. And what percentage do you think scored genius level this time around?
I'd say from 50 to 70.
You're being optimistic because the actual number was 30%. Just within 5 years, and they're still at a very young, tender age, we see that percentage has dropped drastically to just 30%. As Grant likes to often call these people who are 15 years old, there's those teenage years, the problematic sort of age. My daughter's just turned 15 as well, so she's kind of at that age. What percentage of those 15-year-olds do we think scored genius level?
Okay, I should be pessimistic now. Let's say 15 to 0.
Okay, you're going from 0 to 15%, so a real kind of small range. Well, you're not far off. It was 12%. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. George Land redid the test amongst adults, and it was a large sample of about 260,000 adults, so a huge population. What percentage of adults do we think scored genius level?
I'm actually scared now, but let's say from 2 to 8%.
Way, you're getting much better at this now, Yuri. So it was actually 2%. So let's just think about that for a moment. If we think about our stakeholders, we think about our team members, the people that we're working with every day, only 2% of those people in that room would score genius level in this creativity test. And that's for a whole host of reasons. Predominantly it's because over the years we feel that we don't want to share our ideas, or we feel we're not creative because people have told us that our ideas aren't good enough, or they've criticized what we've said. And so we've sort of suppressed this creativity. And if we think about some of the big tech firms out there that are supposed to be super innovative, the likes of Meta, Google, and others, even in those organizations, a very tiny percentage of those people are super, super creative. So imagine all the ideas that have never taken flight because of this reason. And our ability to draw and our confidence in drawing follows a similar pattern. We're super confident when we're really young, but then in our adult years, it seems like that creativity and our confidence seems to diminish. So it's no wonder, when Grant said, when we're running a session and we ask, 100 people in a room, how confident are you in your drawing? A very small handful of people put up their hands. And really, that's the mission that we're on, is to make this accessible to everybody, especially BAs, because we feel that, other professions like user experience, product management, product ownership, these professions are thriving if we look at them. I've been doing a lot of research on BAs recently in terms of the trends, the job trends, the demands for BAs, because by day I work for a company that gives training to business analysts and other tech professionals. And I'm finding some really startling statistics where the BA profession on paper looks like it's diminishing in terms of the demand for jobs, in terms of those skills. Now, in reality, I don't think it is diminishing. What I think is happening is BAs are being rebranded as other professions. So we're seeing all these other job titles popping up, like service designers, UX people, etc. And the reason people are flocking to these other professions is because I think on the face of it, they sound cooler than the BA role. But everything that BAs do, I feel, is cool, right? We collaborate, we engage, we use these amazing visuals. It just feels like we've missed a trick as a BA profession. And that's really where I think Grant and I are on this mission to show people that you've got these extra superpowers. If you could stand up in front of a room full of stakeholders, pick up the pen, and start articulating a visual story, how cool would that be?
Yes, it would be. And well, first, I'm very sad for a lot of people, for a lot of adults who are not achieving that result, unfortunately. I'm not sure where it goes, if it diminishes with the time with advancement of technology, or it advances the number of people that are geniuses in terms of creativity. Really not sure. Not sure, because it could be both ways actually. I could find arguments for both ways. Now we could probably assume that there is a person, there is a business analyst or any other professional, but let's say business analyst who develop those skills, right? They understand the alphabet, they know the basics, they maybe look into some advanced stuff. So how would they apply all their skills in business analysis? What are the most common application cases? Patty, maybe you could continue on that.
Yeah, I think we've touched upon a few of these, but I'm going to go back to visual storytelling because what ends up happening is, as a business analyst, you're in the weeds, we're in the detail, we're asked to analyze, we're asked to pull together requirements, like all of this complex information. And we then send out a big, thick document, often, which is our requirement specification or functional design specification. However, where I think we often struggle is actually articulating the key ideas to our stakeholders. And as we mentioned, it's really difficult for people to really digest all that information because we're living in this TikTok age. People don't have the time, they don't have the patience, and there's friction there. So I think as BAs, we have an opportunity to reduce friction when it comes to articulating information to our stakeholders. And so I think as BAs, we can definitely look to master this approach of visual storytelling. And by that, what I mean is when we're running those requirements workshops or presentations, when we want people to make decisions, we want them to sign off on things, rather than looking across the whole volume of requirements, like all those possible features that we want them to sign off on, if we're able to almost take it a level up, and we call this chunking up, right? So we're going from this detailed level up, and if we're able to create a memorable story for that stakeholder to say, well, how is this going to improve somebody's life? How are these features going to make an impact on our users? And we can do that through lots of novel ways. Like I told a story not so long ago to some of my stakeholders all about Santa Claus. Now, what has Santa Claus got to do with anything? Well, the story is so absurd that it became memorable. And so our brains love novelty. So I think one aspect is taking lots of like information and articulating in such a way that we simplify the message so that people just remember the core themes, but also making it novel. And I think that's where the visual side can come into it because we can start to really have some fun with visuals. And I think it also expresses your personality. The fact that I'm talking about Santa Claus might tell people that I love presents. I don't know. That's just me.
Yeah, that's rather advanced example, right, of application, because storytelling and especially visual storytelling is it requires a lot of skills. Maybe you could recall kind of standard practices of application, maybe something more down to the earth.
Yeah, so I'll just mention another great TED talk. So there's a guy called Tom Wujek who does this experiment whereby he asks his audience a question and he says, I'd like you to visualize and draw out how to make toast. So for BAs, this is almost like a process flow, but he asks them to draw it out in a visual format. So rather than just putting down the actions, we visualize them. And he runs this over multiple rounds. And the first round, he gets the individuals to do it on their own. And then he'll ask them to sort of pair up with other people. And what he finds is as we bring more people in to the conversation and run this over multiple rounds, we get a lot more steps in the process. So in the first instance, we might have jumped straight into taking the bread and putting it into the toaster. Well, someone might say, well, hang on, is the toaster even switched on? Ah, okay, so we need to switch it on. So there's often assumptions that we make on our own. And I think this is a great example of where, when we're visualizing things, especially with our stakeholders, we can identify gaps, we can identify or bring opportunities for other people to input into the conversation. However, if I just had all of this information written down on a piece of paper, it's much more difficult for somebody to really connect with that message, because for them, they can't imagine making toast until they visualize it on a picture. So I think when we're running through those sort of process workshops and we're trying to get stakeholders engaged and getting inputs from lots of people, just by having those simple visuals, and Grant absolutely nailed this earlier, process flows are quite boring, right? They have the syntax of the little squares, the rectangles, the diamond shapes. But just by adding a little icon, having some people in key parts of that process flow, just makes it more engaging. And I think it gets people to really connect with it.
I do agree, and it feels like things like sketch notes or decorating the model as I'm not sure who was that grantor you mentioned before when you talked about models, stuff like this, and problem framing. These are very common ways of think and ways to catch information and deliver information, both in business analysis and outside, right? And those are pretty much standard. And but there are advanced techniques like you started on storytelling. But Grant, maybe you could share more about advanced ways of delivering business analysis with visual thinking and in general ways of think visually.
Yeah, I mean, I think Paddy's given some great examples there, and that draw toast activity he just mentioned is a fantastic one to demonstrate to a room full of BAs how powerful visual thinking can be. Because you give them the simple problem of showing us how they make toast, and you get 10 different models with 10 different BAs. And then they start to see the differences. And if we just talked about something and we didn't visualize what we meant by it, we're all making assumptions about what each other means by the words. So when we visualize things, we make those assumptions explicit. We show people what we mean. And then, like Paddy said, they can spot, did you plug the toaster in? So that's a great example of teaching people the principle. In terms of where you can take it, I think once you've honed your visual thinking skills to the point where you're comfortable, you know the visual alphabet, you know how to articulate yourself visually, I think the natural extension is just that you can start to use it more readily when you need to. So the way I started using visuals in my BA work was I'd sit in a meeting, I'd listen, we'd have a conversation, I would take some notes, I would have my own visuals that I would tidy up and enhance after the meeting, and then I'd use that to play back the understanding that I'd heard. So what was good about that was I could do that in a low pressure way. I could take the time to represent the visual and rearrange it if I needed to, and then I play it back to get the feedback. And that's really powerful. But there's a lag, right? I've got to take it away. I've got to do something. I've got to bring people back together. Whereas if you can actually flip on a document camera like I just did, or stand in front of a whiteboard, and while the conversation's happening, you start drawing what you're hearing. Is this what you meant? Well, where does the information flow after this point? Oh, it goes to this database here, and you start drawing that out. You're actually getting real time feedback from the group, and you're enriching the conversation as you go. And even better, if you do this, by the way, Paddy and I taught a group recently on how to formulate rich pictures where you think about a problem situation and you start to think about who are the actors and how are they interacting with each other and where are the pain points or opportunities. But what we teach is when you do that, try and put one visual per post-it first of all, because what that means is you can then rearrange things. So if somebody comes along like Paddy and says, what about plugging in the toaster? And you haven't left room for it on your diagram. You're like, oh. Whereas if they're on post-its, you can move things around in real time. You can have a conversation. You can synthesize. So I think once you've learned the skills, the point is you can start to do things more real time, enrich feedback. And I think the point Paddy was making about the group contributing to the model, it's a proven and sort of phenomenon where if you try and draw a complicated diagram and you share it with somebody who's never seen it before, they experience map shock. They can't take in the amount of information. But if they were in the room contributing to a discussion, and then that visual is what came out of the room, they understand it because they were there, they co-created it. And so I think there's huge benefits to getting people in the room, whether it's a physical or virtual room, but co-creating the outputs. So I think that's a huge one in terms of using visuals. And then I think the other one, Paddy talked about sketchnoting, and my personal experience of that is I would use sketch notes for my own benefit, my own learning. And as I got more confident and a little braver, I've sketch noted live at conferences, and people have then asked for copies of them, and it kind of helps spread the word about different topics in the BA community. And so that's really powerful. But you do need to develop a certain level of skill to do that. I can do it, but I find that quite draining because you have to listen, synthesize, think of a visual metaphor, draw it, all whilst listening to what the next thing is. So it's quite full on. It's not for everybody, but I think there are different ways you can take it, but it's all built on the same foundational skills we talked about earlier.
Everything you said and everything we discussed makes me feel like business analysts are actually boring because we are, we do a lot of serious stuff, and the profession frames us to be strict and structured and serious and not silly, not witty in any case. But, you know, probably maybe that's the problem why people flock around UI, UX, and stuff like that, because we don't do enough storytelling, enough of drawings, visual stuff. And yeah, we are boring actually. Probably we should just embrace that and change something with that.
I'm always quite vocal about this because I am so passionate about the role, having started my career as a business analyst and done it for many years. And I as big supporter of the BA community. I feel like we we need a rebrand as a profession. And I just can't understand it because we're so fixated on becoming a requirements factory, right? Let's write reams and reams of requirements. I can even remember my manager in one of my first roles. He put down one of my objectives was to draft as many BRDs as I could, and for them to go through no more than 3 iterations. So I was being rewarded for trying to get them as complete as possible, as quickly as possible. And I was going to get rewarded for that. Well, as we know, life doesn't work like that. And it's actually better, I think, if you have more iterations of a document rather than less, because that shows it's been through some thorough thinking. And I just think we've been really focused on the wrong things. It's been about the deliverables. How many documents can you produce? If I had two BAs come to me, one had produced 5 requirements and another had produced 100, I'd reward the one that's given me 100, thinking they've done a way better job. But actually, those 100 may not be correct. They may be completely the wrong thing. And those 5 may have taken a lot more time and effort and refinement to get it down to 5. So I think there's a bit of a mindset shift that's probably needed. And we should look to some of these other professions that are thriving to see how can we learn from them. And I keep talking about UX because it's a very visual profession. BAs equally define, if not as many, if not more, visuals than UX designers. Like we just talk about some of those different diagrams that we can produce, right? Data flow diagrams, sequence diagrams, activity diagrams, process flow diagrams. Like there are reams and reams of them. And if we started to make that a core element of the role and produce those visuals in such a way that they become super engaging, and if we're able to articulate our messages in a really compelling way, if we become super facilitators of conversations and start to move away from these requirements factories, I think the whole profession, it would be a breath of fresh air from my side anyway if I would see that.
I do agree with that absolutely. And well, with that, maybe you could share a story about how visual thinking, let's say, dramatically changed the output of a project or initiative. Just to show people how effective it could be and how important it could be.
My role now is more of a sort of a product manager, product director type of role. So I work in an environment where I have to present boring things like revenue, right? And so a few years ago, I remember we were running 2 days of what we call range reviews. And by that, what we mean is each of the portfolio directors had to present back to the exec team and the CEO of the company the strategy. So I head up a particular area, which is agile and business analysis. And so I had to present my strategy as well as the health of the portfolio. And I had the graveyard shift. I was the very last person to present on the second day. So the execs had 2 days of PowerPoint slides. And I remember it got to my turn and I asked permission. I said to my CEO, I said, Paul, would you mind if I didn't use slides? And he said, do whatever you want. Like we're absolutely open to whatever you feel like doing. And so just as Grant switched over to his document camera in this particular episode, I did a similar thing. So I switched over to my other camera and I started drawing some visuals. And I remember an iPod, if anyone remembers what an iPod looks like. And I explained to the exec team that my portfolio felt like it was an iPod. And what I meant by that was when iPods first came out, they were super cool. They absolutely revolutionized the world. But now they are kind of out of date and there's cooler gadgets out there. And so what I was trying to say was the portfolio when it first came out was great. It was super cool, but now it needed investment and upgrading. And just by using a simple visual like that, it really hit home the message. And I remember the execs starting to talk to me in the language of iPods. They were like, "Oh, so you're telling me the portfolio, the headphones are broken, the whole device needs upgrading?" And I was like, "Yes." And it just got them to think in a different way. So rather than me presenting lots of slides, I managed to draw 4 visuals. And within those 4 visuals, I was able to get their support in terms of what I needed because I needed some help. And it became this recurring theme. So every time I would present to our CEO, the first thing he would say is, "Hey, Paddy, do you have a doodle for me today?" And even to this day, whenever I present to our salespeople, there's an expectation that I'm going to do it visually rather than using slides. And it's kind of become a bit of a signature part of my role. And I just remember in that session, as soon as I started drawing, I looked at the body language on the cameras, and these execs, super busy people, their body language completely changed. They were like sat like this, and then I slowly saw their heads lean in to the camera. And straight away, I knew that they were engaged in what I was talking about. So I think for me, that was a pivotal moment because I was speaking to the leaders of the organization and they'd given me permission to use visual thinking in a really formal presentation. And that's when I knew that this can apply in any context, in any area.
I remember I went in as a consultant to work for a company probably about 10 years ago now, and they were very structured in their approach. Everything was based on UML and use cases, and they modeled all of the artifacts. They produced sequence diagrams, they produced class diagrams to explain the interactions and the objects that were relevant to the use case. And you would generate an output from this tool, this modeling tool, that would form the requirement specification. And it was like 100+ pages of stuff. And the problem was nobody actually read it. I mean, maybe the technical architects, the solution architect guys, maybe, but all the business people, they just didn't get it. And I'd been working in a more agile environment prior to this. And I was like, I can't turn up with this 100-page document at my stakeholder's desk in the business and say, can you review this with me? It'll be painful, right? So I I decided I would just produce a separate artifact. I produced some slides. It had a hand-drawn visual that explained the context of the problem we were trying to solve and the proposed solution. So 2 pages as is in a 2B view, with highlighting the key changes that needed to happen to enable that to happen. And then it was kind of like, and by the way, that's all written down in this 100-page document next to me. I'll highlight the relevant bits you care about. Are you okay to kind of approve this now? And on the back of that, people then started asking for those summary documents in favour of the actual formal artifact because they resonated. And I think the point is, it's about appreciating the audience you're working with. So we've maybe been a bit mean to traditional BAs and BA outputs today, but I think we're trying to make the point that those models we've traditionally produced, they're useful in certain circumstances. But you have to remember who your audience is. So, like I said, if you're speaking to a real technical person and maybe they want a really precise state transition diagram that makes it really clear how they should code something, fair enough. They're on the same page, they understand the abstract language. But if you're trying to show that to a business person and they want to know how's this going to change things for me, you have to lean into them. You have to communicate in their language in a more universal way. And so I think what we're preaching is about using visual thinking to amplify the good work that BAs already do, but just make it easier to digest, easier to engage with. And if you do that right, people will seek it out. So like Paddy said, people saying, are you going to do another doodle for us today? Because they want to see that rather than a boring set of bullet points. I get the same thing once I've worked on a project. They're like, can Grant attend this meeting because we want one of those visual outputs because we know it's going to add value. And so I think it actually has that benefit, I guess. And Paddy, you've probably seen it yourself, that it almost boosts your own profile. It makes you stand out. So that there's actually a personal benefit as well as for your stakeholders.
With knowing how to do that and how to apply visual thinking, how to learn it, how to develop skills, I can't stop but think about tools that you could use, to be better in using visual thinking. Grant, maybe you could share about the critical tools that you use or what people should use when they apply visual thinking.
So there's a few tools that you can leverage. I gave the example of my document camera that I switched to earlier. That is probably my most used visual thinking tool, in that I can just switch cameras, grab a pen and paper, and I can communicate visually. So quite a low fidelity solution once you've switched cameras. But what I do to make that easier to manage is I have a little piece of hardware called the Stream Deck. I don't know if you've come across those, Yuri.
Yeah.
But you can basically configure this little device that has buttons on it to do different things. And I use it to switch my camera view. So it means I can seamlessly click a button and switch from one camera to the other. And that is great. I can be on a call, switch cameras, start drawing, flick back, have eye contact, and so on. So that's probably the main thing that I use day in, day out. In terms of digital tools, I love Miro. I don't know if you've come across that whiteboard tool, Yuri, but it's I don't use that so much for actually drawing, but I use it for uploading my drawings as a visual canvas to get people to collaborate with it. So it's a really good way of you can prepare some visual scaffolding for a conversation, upload it to Miro, lock it, and then people can cluster post-it notes around different areas of the visual map or the canvas. And you have now AI baked into Miro where you can then say, synthesize what's in this quadrant of this visual, and it'll give you the answer. So once it's digitized, you can really kind of streamline your workflow on the back of it. So I love Miro for that sort of angle as well.
I love Miro too. I use it a lot lately, specifically. Paddy, do you have anything to add for that?
Yeah, it's one that we mentioned earlier. I think Grant mentioned the fact that you can use the annotation within PowerPoint. And I think that's a hidden secret that not many people know about or use, because whenever we're talking about visual thinking, people always ask us about the cool tools that are available. And we're like, PowerPoint. And people often miss that. And I think, again, it's about friction. If you're running a presentation, it's sometimes quite tricky for you to switch between different apps and trying to change screens and all of this good stuff. So if you just want a really seamless experience for your audience and yourself, then there's a little pencil when you're in presentation mode of your presentation. Click that and you can start drawing right on your slide directly. Now, for that, you really need a decent input device. So using a mouse can be
Mm,
tricky, especially when you're drawing. And there's something called a Wacom tablet, and it's just a little rectangular or square shape. You can get them super cheap. I think they're like around £30, and it just allows you to draw with a little pencil, and
mm,
that acts as an input device, a bit like a mouse. So again, if just by investing £30, you can use PowerPoint in this way. And the other one that we use, especially for when we're doing that kind of visual designer, visual thinking kind of stance, is Procreate. So Procreate is a great app for digitizing your visuals. And
mm.
again, it's super cheap. I think it's about £20 for the year. And we use it on the sort of iPad, and it's super easy to use. And that's probably one of our favorites as well.
Thank you for sharing that. The last one seems specifically interesting. I will definitely delve into that. I cannot let you go talking about visuals without talking about AI because, of course, AI helps us a lot. And it's not rather a question, but your thoughts on how AI changes the visual thinking and how it helps with visual thinking with all the tools. So, Paddy, what do you think about that?
Yeah, like, although Grant and I do a lot of hand drawn visual thinking and we train those techniques, we're not wedded to just using hand drawn visuals. Like for us, visual thinking is about visuals, and whether you use stock images,
Mm,
whether we're using AI generated images, as long as we're able to, have impact and get our audience to engage in new ways, then I think that's the most important thing. So I've got nothing against AI, and there are lots of new tools that we're seeing all the time. We're seeing Mid Journey being enhanced. We're seeing the tools within OpenAI's own platform like DALI and a bunch of others. However, what we do find, especially if you're trying to get people to connect, is that hand drawn visuals just have, I don't know what it is. There must be some science behind it. There's just something special about them that when you have them in your slides, or when we've posted social media posts and we've posted the same image generated with AI versus hand drawn, the hand drawn one always gets way more engagement. And I think part of that is the emotional connection that the audience have with that. The fact that someone spent the time and effort to hand draw this, right? They've obviously put some effort into this, and maybe that's the trigger for them then to like that post. But we always find hand drawn visuals seem to get more engagement. But one of the platforms that I'll mention, if someone is thinking about using an element of AI, is called Drawify. So Drawify is a great platform that was designed for people who perhaps don't want to draw things by hand, but they still want hand drawn visuals. And so there's over 50,000 hand drawn visuals that have been uploaded to the platform. And they've now added some AI capability. I think it's called Maya, is the AI that they've got in there. And you can go on there and you can put in a simple prompt to say, this is what I want to achieve. I want to create a presentation that has these key points and it's about this topic. And what Drawify will do is it will start to give you a storyboard of visuals that you can then literally lift and shift. Or you can individually take the hand drawn visuals and create your own slide, just by handcrafting your slides through that. So that's again one of my favorite tools out there for visual thinkers.
Very similar perspective to Paddy on this. I use AI myself to create visuals. I think as things stand, I still think you can spot an AI generated image. They've got a certain look. Some platforms are better than others, but none of them at the moment are that good at doing those really simple, basic hand drawn visuals with text as well, which it's a matter of time, right? It'll come and they'll be able to do it. But no, I'm open to using them. But what I find useful with AI is if I'm trying to think about a way to create my own hand drawn visual, but I'm struggling for an idea for a metaphor that could
Mm,
be a bit different. I don't want to draw another light bulb to represent an idea. I want to have something different. Then actually, AI is a really great sounding board for being able to say, give me 10 suggestions for metaphors for an idea, and then see where that conversation takes you, and then you produce a visual output. So you're really using it as a muse to get inspiration.
absolutely, absolutely. AI would definitely help at getting metaphors, for example, or even ideas what to draw. You
Yeah,
know, just to imagine what could it be. Again, unfortunately, a lot of adults are far from genius in terms of creativity. Well, as we learned today, that's a problem. But maybe that's one of the problems government should address. I don't know. But anyway, thank you for sharing that, Grant, Patty. I enjoyed our conversation a lot today, and I hope that all people who watch this, they will learn from you, and business analysts who can be much better with what they do, we will become less boring and more engaging with what we do with our stakeholders.